Mason Carter froze in disbelief. Overnight, someone had fenced off his entire ranch, and the only gate was padlocked shut. His horses were trapped inside, his truck blocked out, and his land suddenly felt like a prison. And standing right there, clutching the shiny new gate key as if she owned the place, was Karen Whitfield, the head of the HOA. From now on, she smirked, you'll need our permission to enter your own property. Mason's heart pounded. His ranch was his life's work, the place where he poured years of sweat, savings, and soul. Yet suddenly, a stranger now held the key. He knew this wasn't just about a fence. It was about power, and unless he fought back, he could lose everything. The ranch had always been Mason's sanctuary. After retiring from decades of long shifts as a mechanic, he finally bought the land he'd dreamed of owning since he was a boy. He loved the rolling green pastures, the shade of the old oak trees, and the barn that creaked with character. Every morning, he fed his horses before sipping coffee on the porch. It was peace, the kind of peace he had worked his whole life for. But peace was the last thing the HOA wanted for him. The trouble had started weeks earlier. Mason had heard whispers from neighbors that the HOA board was planning new community standards. Most people brushed it off as harmless rules, paint colors, lawn lengths, maybe mailbox designs. But Mason knew the HOA reputation. They thrived on control, and Karen Whitfield was their sharpest weapon. Karen was the type who never smiled without a smirk, never asked without demanding. She wore crisp suits in a town that lived in jeans, and she carried herself like the streets, fences, and even the trees somehow belonged to her. She had run the HOA for 3 years, and in that time, dozens of neighbors had fallen into line. But Mason wasn't one of them. He had deliberately bought outside the HOA jurisdiction, or so he thought. Now, staring at the towering new fence that had appeared overnight, Mason realized Karen had found a loophole and she was exploiting it. "This is illegal," Mason said, his voice steady but boiling underneath. "You can't just fence me off my own land." Karen raised an eyebrow. "Actually, Mr. Carter, I can. This section of your driveway, you see, runs along HO, a controlled land. We voted last week to extend the fencing here for community security. If you'd like a key, you'll have to register with the HOA, pay dues, and agree to the new bylaws. Until then." She dangled the key on her finger, the metal glinting in the morning sun. "You'll stay locked out." Mason clenched his fists. His horses were already whinnying restlessly beyond the fence. He had hay to haul, stalls to clean, and animals depending on him. Yet here he was, standing outside like a trespasser on his own property. "I'm not joining your HOA," he said flatly. Karen's smirk only widened. "Then I suppose you're not getting this key." She turned and strutted away, her heels clicking against the gravel. Mason stood frozen, fury rising in his chest. Neighbors peeked through curtains, watching but saying nothing. They all knew better than to cross Karen. That night, Mason sat on his porch, staring at the fence glowing silver in the moonlight. His mind churned with questions. How had Karen pulled this off legally? How far would she go? And most of all, how could he fight back? He wasn't a man who picked fights, but he was a man who finished them. Mason leaned forward, his voice low but fierce. "If they want to play games," he muttered, "then let's play." But the very next morning, Mason opened his mailbox and found an envelope from the HOA, and what it contained made the fence look like the smallest of his problems. If you think the HOA fence stunt was outrageous, wait until you see how Mason turns the tables on them. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the shocking twists ahead. The morning air was cool as Mason Carter walked down the gravel path toward his mailbox. He hadn't slept much the night before every time he closed his eyes, he saw Karen's smug face holding that key. His horses had been restless all night, too, trapped behind the fence that cut off the pasture. Mason knew something had to give, but when he opened the rusted mailbox, his stomach dropped. Inside was a crisp white envelope, stamped with the HOA emblem, an oak tree surrounded by neat block letters spelling out "Preserve." "Protect, enforce." Mason tore it open, expecting more empty threats. Instead, What he read made his jaw tighten in disbelief. Dear Mr. Carter, as of this week, the Homeowners Association has determined that your property is in violation of multiple community standards, including, but not limited to, unapproved fencing, unauthorized livestock, and noncompliance with neighborhood dues. Immediate corrective action is required. Failure to comply will result in fines of $500 per day, escalating until resolution. At the bottom, in sharp black ink, was Karen Whitfield's signature. Mason's hands shook as he read it again. Unapproved fencing. He didn't even build the fence they had. Unauthorized livestock. His horses had been on the land long before the HOA ever set foot near it. And dues. He had never agreed to join, never signed a contract, never attended a single HOA meeting. This wasn't a violation notice. It was a trap. Later that morning, Mason drove into town, clutching the letter in his hand. He walked into the county clerk's office, hoping to find answers. The clerk, a tired-looking man with reading glasses, examined the letter and frowned. Mr. Carter, your property's deed shows it's outside the HOA original boundary. They shouldn't have authority here. Mason leaned forward. Then how are they pulling this off? The clerk sighed. A few months ago, the HOA filed an amendment to extend their jurisdiction. It slid through unnoticed. Technically, they're claiming shared rights over the road that cuts across your driveway. That may give them leverage. Mason's pulse quickened. So they boxed me in by redrawing lines on a map. Exactly. The clerk said grimly, it's shady, but not unheard of. You'd need a lawyer to fight it. Back at the ranch, Mason sat on his porch with the letter in hand. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind. He could hire a lawyer, but that would take months, maybe years. Meanwhile, the HOA could rack up fines, pressure him, even try to foreclose. That's when he noticed his neighbors. One by one, cars slowed as they drove past his ranch. Some drivers gave sympathetic looks. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Word was spreading. Karen must have already told everyone that Mason was refusing to comply. That evening, as Mason fed his horses through the narrow gap at the gate, he heard footsteps crunching on gravel. He turned to see his neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, clutching a casserole dish. Mason, she whispered, glancing nervously toward the street, I heard what they're doing to you. It's wrong. You've always kept your land in good shape. The board, they're overreaching. Mason gave her a grateful nod. Thank you. I'm not letting them push me out. This ranch is mine. She handed him the casserole with trembling hands. Be careful. Karen doesn't like to lose. Mason looked past her to the glowing porch lights of Karen's house at the end of the road. She was probably sitting there, satisfied, believing she had boxed him in, but Karen had underestimated him. That night, Mason spread out maps and documents across his kitchen table. He studied the HOA boundaries, the land plats, and the ownership records. There had to be a weakness in their scheme, something they overlooked. Then, as his eyes scanned a property map, he saw it. A small strip of land at the far end of the neighborhood. A parcel that connected directly to the HOA, a new gate. And, according to the county records, it was going up for auction next week. Mason's pulse quickened. If he bought that land, he wouldn't just have access. He would own the gate itself. The thought made him sit back in his chair, stunned. Could it really be that simple? He smiled for the first time in days. The HOA thought they had trapped him, but they had left the door wide open, and he was about to walk right through. But when Mason arrived at the auction, he realized he wasn't the only one interested in that strip of land, and the person bidding against him made his blood run cold. The small county courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and paper, a place where history and struggle lingered in the air. Mason Carter walked through its double doors with steady steps, his heart pounding beneath his calm exterior. Clutched in his hand was a cashier's check, his entire savings, scraped together for this one chance to turn the tables on the HOA. The property in question was nothing more than a narrow strip of land. On paper, it looked useless, but Mason knew better. That strip connected directly to the new gate, the very gate Karen Whitfield had locked him out of. If he owned it, he wouldn't just regain his freedom. He'd control the access point the HOA believed they ruled. The auction room was quiet at first. A few local farmers, a real estate agent, and a handful of curious townsfolk filled the benches. Mason chose a seat near the front, every muscle tense. Then he saw her, Karen Whitfield. She strolled into the room like she owned it. A thin smile plastered across her face. Behind her trailed two HOA board members, both whispering and carrying folders. Mason's stomach clenched, of course. She had discovered the same loophole. Karen caught his eye, tilted her head, and gave a mocking little wave. It was all the confirmation he needed she was here to outbid him. The auctioneer, an elderly man with suspenders and a booming voice, tapped his gavel. Lot number 17, a parcel of 2 acres, located at the eastern boundary of the Willow Creek subdivision. Opening bid, $5,000. 5, Mason said firmly, raising his hand. Almost instantly, Karen's voice rang out. 6. Mason clenched his jaw. He'd expected this. 7. Karen smirked. 10. Gasps rippled through the small crowd. Most people in the room knew that strip of land wasn't worth a fraction of that amount. But Mason understood this wasn't about land value. This was a war. The numbers climbed higher. 15. 20. 25. Every time Mason raised his hand, Karen countered with a smile that cut like a knife. He could feel the room watching them, the tension thick as everyone realized this was no ordinary sale. By the time the auctioneer called, 30,000, do I hear 35? Mason's palms were slick with sweat. That was nearly the ceiling of what he had saved. He glanced at the check in his pocket. $8,000. That was his limit. 35, Mason said, his voice steady though his chest tightened. Karen didn't hesitate. 40. The room went silent. Even the auctioneer paused, surprised. $40,000 for a strip of land no one else wanted. It was madness. Mason's stomach dropped. He didn't have 40. He had 38. If he bid again, he'd risk humiliation when he couldn't back it up. Karen knew it too. She leaned back in her chair, triumphant, tapping her manicured nails against the folder in her lap. The auctioneer's voice echoed. 40,000 going once, going twice. Mason's mind raced. This was his chance, his one shot to beat the HOA at their own game. He couldn't let Karen win, not here, not like this. But how? He was boxed in, just like she'd planned. And then, just as the gavel was about to fall, a voice rang out from the back of the room. 45. Every head in the courthouse whipped around. Standing at the back was an older man in worn boots and a cowboy hat, his hand raised confidently. Mason blinked in shock. He didn't know the man. But the stranger's eyes met his, and for a brief second, Mason swore he saw something like solidarity in them. Karen's smirk faltered. She hadn't expected competition beyond Mason. The auctioneer's gavel hovered midair. 45,000. Do I hear 50? Karen shot to her feet. 50. Her voice cracked ever so slightly, the first hint of strain. The stranger didn't flinch. 55. Mason's heart pounded. Who was this man? Why was he suddenly fighting Karen? And more importantly, was he a friend or another threat? The auctioneer beamed. 55,000 going once, going twice. The gavel slammed down. Sold. The room erupted in whispers. Karen looked furious, her face flushed red. Mason sat stunned, torn between relief and confusion. He hadn't won the land, but neither had she. The stranger walked calmly to the clerk's desk to sign the paperwork. Before leaving, he tipped his hat toward Mason, gave a knowing smile, and walked out without a word. Mason sat frozen in his seat. He had no idea who the man was or why he'd just paid double the land's value. But deep down, he sensed this was far from over. That evening, as Mason returned home, he found a letter taped to his front door. It wasn't from the HOA, it was from the mysterious bidder, and what it said left him speechless. The courtroom was silent except for the faint hum of the ceiling fans. Samuel sat at the plaintiff's table, his hand steady, but his heart pounding like a drum echoing through the chambers of justice. Across the room, Karen and the HOA board members sat with smug faces, already whispering among themselves as if victory were inevitable. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman with years of experience, looked over her glasses. "We will now hear the evidence presented by the defense," she said, motioning to Samuel's lawyer. With a calm nod, Samuel's lawyer stood and held up a thick brown folder. "Your Honor, what you are about to see will change this case entirely." The HOA lawyer chuckled, crossing his arms. "We've heard that before. This man has no legal standing against the community." But Samuel's lawyer wasn't rattled. He walked to the clerk's desk, placed the folder down, and slowly opened it. Inside were the original purchase documents of Samuel's ranch, signed, notarized, and filed with the county. The property map was highlighted, showing the exact boundaries of his land, boundaries that stretched far beyond what the HOA had assumed. "Ladies and gentlemen," the lawyer said, holding up the documents for everyone to see, "not only is this ranch legally Samuel's property, but," he paused, letting the silence grow heavy, "the only road that leads to the HOA gated community runs directly across Samuel's land." A ripple of gasps swept through the room. Even the judge leaned forward. Karen's confident smile faltered, and her eyes darted to the HOA board members, who now looked uneasy. The lawyer continued, "Which means that when the HOA fenced him out of his own ranch, they weren't just trespassing. They illegally restricted access to land they have no right to. They effectively built a gate on someone else's private property." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Is this accurate?" The clerk quickly checked the county's property records, tapping furiously at the computer. Then she looked up, her eyes wide. "Your Honor, it's correct. The HOA gate is indeed sitting on land that belongs entirely to Mr. Samuel Harris." The courtroom erupted in whispers, shocked murmurs filling the air. Karen shot up from her seat. "That's impossible. We're the HOA. We control the neighborhood." The judge banged her gavel, silencing the room. "Order. Mrs. Karen, sit down. You will speak when permitted." Samuel sat tall, his face calm, but his heart swelled with vindication. For weeks, he had been made to feel powerless, an outsider in his own land, and now the truth was turning the tables in the most dramatic way possible. The HOA lawyer stammered, "Your Honor, this must be a clerical error. The maps must be outdated. Surely there's an explanation." But the judge's expression hardened. "I don't deal in assumptions. I deal in facts, and right now, the facts clearly show this HOA built a gate where they had no legal right. That is a serious matter." Karen's face went pale. She tried to protest, but her voice shook. We didn't know. It was just, we thought." But the judge wasn't listening anymore. She turned her attention back to Samuel's lawyer. "Proceed." Samuel's lawyer smiled faintly. "Thank you, Your Honor. To put it simply, not only does Samuel retain full rights to his ranch, but he also holds authority over the only gate key the HOA depends on." Meaning, he let the words hang like a guillotine in the air. The HOA needs his permission to access their own homes. The silence that followed was deafening. Every board member froze, their smugness gone, replaced by panic. Karen's eyes widened in horror, realizing the full weight of their mistake. Samuel leaned back in his chair, breathing deeply. For the first time since the ordeal began, he wasn't the one on trial. The HOA was. And as the judge adjusted her glasses and prepared to deliver her statement, Samuel knew one thing with certainty: the game had just turned in his favor. But what the judge said next would send shockwaves through the entire courtroom, leaving everyone, especially Karen, utterly speechless. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. Karen sat frozen, her manicured hands clenched on the table, her eyes darting between the judge and Samuel. The HOA board members whispered among themselves, but their faces betrayed their fear. They knew the storm was about to break, and it wasn't going to be in their favor. The judge leaned forward, folding her hands. Her voice was calm, yet carried the weight of authority. "Mr. Harris, the court recognizes your full ownership of the ranch, including the land upon which the HOA gate now stands. By law, the HOA has trespassed and unlawfully restricted your access. This is not just a civil dispute, it borders on property rights violations." Gasps echoed around the courtroom. Samuel's chest tightened, but this time with relief. The judge was spelling it out clearly. He wasn't the one in the wrong. The HOA was. Karen shot up from her chair, her voice cracking. "Your Honor, please, this is unfair." "He's twisting the law. That land is part of our community. We've maintained it, landscaped it, invested in it for years." The judge banged her gavel sharply. "Sit down, Mrs. Karen. You assumed rights you did not have. That does not make them yours." Karen sank back into her seat, trembling. For once, she had no clever retorts, no smug confidence. The walls were closing in. Samuel's lawyer stood again, holding up the key to the HOA gate. The silver glinted under the courtroom lights like a symbol of victory. "Your Honor, this key represents the HOA arrogance. They fenced my client out of his own ranch, thinking they could bully him into submission. Instead, they locked themselves behind a gate they don't even own, and now Mr. Harris is the only one with legal authority to decide who passes through." A wave of shocked murmurs filled the room. The HOA board members shifted uncomfortably, realizing the nightmare ahead of them. Their power, built on intimidation, fines, and control, was collapsing in front of their eyes. The judge let the whispers fade before speaking again. "Here is my ruling. The HOA must immediately remove any barriers that block Mr. Harris's access to his ranch. Furthermore, the HOA is prohibited from making any future alterations to property they do not own. If they attempt to restrict his rights again, this court will not hesitate to impose severe legal and financial penalties." Karen's jaw dropped. Financial penalties. She gasped, looking at the board members for support, but they avoided her gaze. None of them dared to speak. Samuel's lawyer nodded, satisfied, but Samuel himself remained calm, his hands folded. He wasn't a man who celebrated victories with arrogance. Instead, he simply exhaled, the weight of weeks of harassment finally lifting. But then, as the gavel fell, something extraordinary happened. The judge looked directly at Samuel. "Mr. Harris, given the location of the only access road, you hold a unique position. Technically, the HOA cannot access their neighborhood without passing through your land. What you choose to do with that authority is entirely up to you, as long as it complies with the law." The courtroom went dead silent. Everyone turned to Samuel. Karen's face drained of color. She whispered, almost in a panic, "No, no, this can't be happening." For the first time in the entire trial, Samuel allowed himself a small, knowing smile. He turned his gaze toward Karen and the board. His voice was steady, almost quiet, but it carried across the entire room. "Funny thing," he said, "they tried to shut me out. But now, they can't even get in without me." The entire courtroom erupted. Some gasped, some even chuckled nervously at the irony, but the HOA members, they sat in stunned silence, realizing the empire of control they had built had collapsed with one man and a single gate key. Karen gripped the edge of the table, her eyes blazing, but deep down she knew the truth. Her reign of control had ended. Yet Samuel wasn't finished. He had one more move to play, one that would leave the HOA and Karen absolutely stunned. The gavel had already fallen, the ruling was clear, but the air in the courtroom still buzzed with shock. Everyone knew the HOA had lost, yet what Samuel would do next, that was the question that lingered like electricity in the silence. Karen leaned forward, her voice trembling but defiant. "This isn't over, Samuel. You can't just hold us hostage with that road. The community won't stand for it." Samuel rose slowly from his seat, his tall frame commanding the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calm, steady tone cut through every corner of the chamber. "Karen," he said evenly, "I never wanted a fight. I never wanted to hold anyone hostage. All I wanted was the peace to work my ranch, the land my father left me, but you and your board decided that wasn't enough. You tried to strip me of my rights, my dignity, and my home. And now, here we are." Karen's lips trembled, but she had no words. Samuel's lawyer placed the gate key in his hand. The cold metal was heavier than it looked, not just in weight, but in meaning. Every eye followed it. The symbol of power, of control, of everything the HOA thought they could take, now rested firmly in Samuel's grasp. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I respect the court's ruling, and I will comply with the law. But as of today, this ranch is mine, entirely mine, which means I decide who uses this land and who doesn't." The judge nodded solemnly. "That is your legal right." Karen's face collapsed. She whispered frantically to the HOA lawyer, but he only shook his head. The battle was over, and she knew it. Then Samuel did something no one expected. He reached into his folder and pulled out a crisp document. His lawyer handed it to the clerk, who quickly passed it to the judge. The judge's brows lifted as she read it aloud. "Mr. Harris has purchased the very parcel of land containing the HOA gate," she said, her voice carrying the revelation, "which means he is now the legal owner of the entrance to the community itself." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, even a few laughs of disbelief. Karen's face drained of color completely. "No," she breathed, "that's not possible. That's our gate. That's our entrance." Samuel's eyes locked on hers, unflinching. "Not anymore." The judge's gavel struck again, but this time it was only to calm the chaos. "Order, order." But even the judge's eyes held a flicker of awe at the boldness of Samuel's move. Samuel stepped forward, his voice calm but resolute. "You tried to fence me out of my own home. You forgot one thing. This land was mine long before your HOA existed. And now, the very key you used to shut me out is the one you'll need just to get home." The HOA board slumped in their seats, defeated. The weight of humiliation and regret hung heavy on their shoulders. Karen, once the loudest voice in the room, now sat in stunned silence, unable to comprehend the total collapse of her power. As Samuel left the courtroom, the key still glinting in his hand, the community outside buzzed with whispers. Some neighbors cheered him quietly. Others simply looked on in awe. But one thing was certain. Samuel had turned the tables in a way no one saw coming. He didn't need revenge in the form of shouting, fighting, or gloating. His revenge was simple, poetic, and undeniable. The HOA, who once tried to shut him out, could no longer step foot in their own neighborhood without him. And as the sun set behind his ranch that evening, Samuel stood at his gate, watching Karen drive up. She stopped, rolled down her window, and glared, her pride shattered. Samuel only smiled, the key dangling from his fingers. "Good evening, Karen. Funny, isn't it? The gate you built to keep me out is now the gate that keeps me in." Her face flushed with humiliation, but she had no choice. She sat there, waiting, powerless, and with a quiet click, Samuel unlocked the gate, stepping aside like the true owner he was. The battle was over. Samuel had won, not just his land, but his dignity, his peace, and a justice so sharp it would be remembered by the entire neighborhood for years to come. And that, folks, is how Samuel turned the tables on an entire HOA. What do you think? Was his revenge poetic justice, or would you have done something different in his place? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget subscribe to the channel so you never miss another jaw-dropping HOA story.